She staggered to his cabin with a baby in her arms, breath ragged, eyes hollow. "Take my child, I can't go on," she wept. He opened his door, not knowing his life was about to change forever. The knock came hard and uneven against the rough-hewn cabin door, the sound of desperation more than strength. Inside, Thomas Hale had been tending the fire, coaxing life into the few glowing embers that still clung to warmth after a long day's hunt. He frowned, the sound setting his nerves on edge. No one came this high into the mountains after nightfall unless they were running from something, or clinging to their last hope. He stood, broad shoulders casting shadows against the dim firelight, and moved toward the door. His hand hovered over the latch for just a second, listening. The wind moaned through the trees outside, carrying with it the brittle edge of snow, but under it he heard something else, a voice, broken and trembling, whispering words more prayer than plea. "Please, please." Thomas pulled the door open, and the night staggered in with a figure half collapsed against the threshold. A woman, her face pale and lips cracked from cold, leaned forward, clutching a bundle to her chest. She all but fell into him, knees buckling, breath coming in gasps that carried no strength. He caught her instinctively, his arms wrapping around both her and the child she held. The child let out a weak cry, not the sharp wail of a babe full of life, but the ragged sound of hunger and weariness. The sound pierced the cabin's quiet like a knife. Thomas looked down, his calloused hand brushing against the bundle, finding the small face within, flushed but still, eyes barely flickering open. The woman's gaze rose to meet his. Tears streaked through the dirt on her cheeks, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "Take my baby, I can't go on." Her words trailed off into a sob that rattled through her thin frame. For a moment Thomas just stood there, stunned. He had lived alone in these mountains for near a decade, and nothing had shaken his world in all that time. He knew blizzards, he knew hunger, he knew the silence of loneliness that crept into a man's bones. But this, the sudden weight of life pressed into his arms by a stranger's breaking hands, this was something else entirely. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The fire threw long shadows, the orange glow falling across the woman's hollowed face. He laid her down gently on a cot in the corner, her arms trembling as they loosened their grip on the child. For a moment she clung still, her eyes wide with the terror of letting go, before exhaustion overcame her and her hands dropped limply. Thomas gathered the baby carefully, as though one wrong move might shatter something fragile beyond repair. The little girl, for that was what she was, blinked once before pressing her cheek against his chest with a faint whimper. His heart clenched at the weight of that trust, small and undeserved. "What's your name?" he asked, though he wasn't sure she could answer. Her lips moved, faint as the last ember before it dies. "Miriam," the name escaped her in a breath, and with it her eyes fluttered shut. Thomas's jaw tightened. He pressed his palm lightly against her forehead. Fever burned there, hot and angry. She had walked herself near to death to reach his cabin, carrying a newborn through the wilderness. No one should have survived that trek, yet somehow she had, long enough to place the child in his hands. The mountain man moved quickly, setting the baby down on the quilt near the fire, wrapping her snug against the warmth. Then he fetched water, coaxing a little between Miriam's cracked lips, careful not to choke her. Her body shook faintly, not from cold but from weakness. Through it all, the baby's faint whimpers filled the cabin like the voice of a soul too fragile for this world. Thomas sat heavily, running a hand down his face. He had thought himself hardened by years of solitude, but already he felt the edges of his life shifting beneath him. He looked from the woman to the child, and something in his chest settled, though it was no easy peace. "You'll both live here now," he murmured, almost as if speaking it aloud might make it real. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He had no family, no experience raising a child, no answers for the storm that had driven her to his door. Still, as the firelight flickered over the tiny face pressed into the quilt, he knew one thing with certainty: turning them away was never an option. The wind outside howled like a warning, and Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of the storm, timbers groaning like old bones in the wind. Thomas Hale sat hunched forward, elbows resting heavy on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire as it threw shadows across the two figures who now occupied his solitary world. Miriam lay on the cot, her breath shallow, her face flushed with fever's cruel heat. Beside the hearth, the baby slept curled in the folds of the quilt, her small chest rising and falling with effort, each breath a fragile victory. Thomas had spent years in silence, the kind of silence that numbs a man and teaches him to keep his thoughts as still as the trees in winter. But tonight his mind refused to still. He replayed every detail: the knock, the desperate plea, the weight of her child in his arms. It wasn't just a woman at his door. It was life itself demanding something of him, something he wasn't sure he had left to give. Baby stirred then, letting out a soft cry that broke the brittle quiet. Thomas rose quickly, boots thudding against the plank floor, and bent over her. She squirmed, her little hands curling into fists, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for comfort. He froze, realizing with a kind of startled helplessness that he had no idea how to tend her. He could mend tools, hunt elk, survive snow that would starve lesser men, but this tiny life was a mystery that no axe or rifle could solve. Instinct won out where knowledge failed. He lifted the girl carefully, cradling her against his chest. She quieted some, her small face pressing against the rough wool of his shirt. Thomas stood there for a long moment, staring down at her, feeling her warmth seep into him like an ember sparking against cold iron. She was so light, so breakable, and yet she carried with her the weight of 1,000 unspoken vows. From the cot, Miriam stirred. Her cracked lips parted and her voice rasped low, no stronger than a breath. "Her name," she coughed, the sound rattling painfully in her chest. Thomas was at her side in 2 strides, lowering himself so she wouldn't have to strain. Her eyes flickered open, glassy with fever, but they burned with the kind of fierce devotion only a mother carries. "Her name is Clara." Thomas repeated it softly, tasting the shape of it in the stillness. Clara, a name with warmth in it, like a flame that refuses to be smothered. He looked at the child again, and the word anchored itself inside him. Clara. She wasn't just a bundle left at his door. She was someone. Miriam's hand lifted weakly, trembling as it reached for her daughter. Thomas guided Clara closer, laying the baby against her mother's chest. Miriam closed her eyes, relief and sorrow mingling in her expression. "Promise me," she whispered, though her voice cracked on the words. If I can't, promise me you'll keep her." The words struck Thomas harder than any storm. He stared at her, his chest tightening. For a long moment he said nothing, unable to speak through the knot in his throat. He had lived his life with no one to answer to, no one to depend on him. The thought of carrying another's life in his hands was heavier than any burden he'd borne. Yet as Clara whimpered softly, rooting instinctively against her mother's chest, Thomas heard himself answer, "You have my word." His voice was steady, though deep inside he felt the tremor of a vow that would bind him more than any chain. Miriam exhaled shakily, her body sinking deeper into the cot as though the promise itself had given her permission to let go. "Thank you," she breathed, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. Thomas stayed there long after her words faded, sitting between them like a sentinel, the fire's glow painting lines of light across his weathered face. Clara had quieted again, her tiny fist resting against her mother's collarbone. Thomas reached out, brushing a strand of damp hair from Miriam's forehead. The fever still raged hot beneath her skin, and he knew the night would decide her fate. He set to work then, moving with a steady urgency born of necessity. He fetched the last of his dried herbs from a tin on the shelf, grinding them into hot water and coaxing what little he could into Miriam's mouth. He laid damp cloths across her brow, refreshing them in the basin as soon as the heat dried them. Each time her body shook with chills, Thomas sat closer, his hand steadying hers until the tremors eased. Hours passed like that, measured only by the crackle of fire and the occasional whimper from Clara. The storm outside pressed on, snow piling heavy against the walls, wind rattling the shutters. The mountain felt smaller tonight, its vast silence reduced to this one cabin where the fight for life played out in hushed breaths and whispered vows. Near dawn, the fever broke. Miriam stirred with more strength this time, her eyes opening clearer than before. She turned her head, gaze finding Clara where the baby now slept curled against Thomas's chest. For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. She likes you," she murmured, her voice weak but carrying a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Thomas looked down at the child, who had nestled into him as though he were more than just a stranger who happened to be near. He swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. He had never been anyone's anchor, never held that kind of place in another's life. And yet here she was, sleeping as though she had chosen him. But peace was fleeting in the mountains. The moment was broken by a sound that froze Thomas where he sat. A faint crack, not from the cabin's timbers or the settling snow, but from outside, wood snapping beneath weight, deliberate and heavy. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning by the door. He rose silently, laying Clara back on the quilt and crossed to the window. Peering through a slit in the shutter, he scanned the pale morning light. Snow stretched in all directions, unbroken save for a set of tracks leading up from the tree line. Fresh tracks. His gut tightened. No one stumbled onto his cabin by chance. Not here, not this far into the mountains. Whoever it was had come with purpose. Behind him, Miriam stirred again, her voice faint. "What is it?" Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the tracks until they disappeared behind the shed. He shifted, the rifle steady in his grip before finally murmuring, "We're not alone." The words lingered heavy in the air. Miriam's eyes widened, fear flashing there even through her exhaustion. She reached instinctively for Clara, pulling the child closer. Thomas stepped back from the window, his face carved with the same grim lines that had carried him through years of solitude. But now the stakes were different. This wasn't just about his own survival anymore. He had given his word, and that meant whoever had come out of the tree line was about to find the mountain man was no easy mark. The silence between the cabin walls stretched so thin it felt like it might shatter. Thomas Hale stood rigid by the shutter, rifle balanced against his palm, his eyes fixed on the faint line of tracks cutting through the snow outside. They weren't the haphazard prints of a wanderer seeking shelter. They were deliberate, steady, the stride of someone who knew exactly where they were headed. And that meant danger was not circling but coming straight for them. Behind him, Miriam drew Clara tighter into her arms, her thin body trembling though not just from fever. The baby stirred at the motion, giving a soft cry before burying her face into her mother's chest. The sound cut Thomas deeper than the icy wind ever could. He turned his head slightly, enough to see Miriam's wide eyes fixed on him, silently asking what words could not. He didn't answer, not with his tongue. He only gave a firm nod, slow but certain, as though to say he hadn't forgotten his vow. That small motion steadied Miriam enough to press her cheek against Clara's downy hair and whisper a prayer. Thomas heard none of the words, only the rhythm, and even that was enough to stir something in him. A reminder that in these mountains, where life balanced on the edge of a blade, faith was sometimes all a soul had left. The crunch of snow outside grew sharper, closer. Thomas eased toward the door, every movement deliberate, boots placed softly on the floorboards. He tested the latch, ensuring it was secure, then pressed his shoulder against the doorframe, waiting. His breathing slowed, eyes narrowing as he strained for any hint beyond the sound of the storm easing. A shadow flickered against the window, then another, not one man, several. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle, jaw locking. Whoever they were, they had come with numbers. That meant they weren't just hunters wandering into the wrong woods. They had intent. "Stay down," Thomas whispered, voice low and firm, not turning as he spoke. Behind him, Miriam shifted lower onto the cot, curling her body protectively around Clara. The baby whimpered but quieted quickly against her mother's warmth. The first knock landed against the cabin door. Unlike Miriam's desperate scrape the night before, this one was bold, loud, and certain. The kind of knock that wasn't a plea for entry but a demand. Thomas didn't move. His silence stretched long enough that the second knock came harder, rattling the hinges. A voice followed, deep and smooth, carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mountain Man," the voice called, "we know you're in there." Thomas said nothing. He only shifted his stance, rifle ready. The man outside continued, his tone almost casual. "We ain't come to harm you, but we've tracked a woman through the pass. Pale, worn thin, carrying a child she had no right to. You seen her." Miriam's breath caught audibly, her hand clutching Clara so tightly the child gave a muffled cry. Thomas's eyes flicked back toward them for the briefest second before returning to the door. The man's voice grew sharper. "She's run long enough. Open your door, hand her over, and no trouble needs to follow." Thomas's jaw flexed. He thought of the woman half frozen at his door, begging him with her last strength to take her baby. He thought of Clara, impossibly small against his chest, of her fragile breaths and Miriam's fevered eyes. He had made a vow, and though his life had been carved by solitude and silence, that vow thundered louder in him than any storm. His answer was not words but action. Thomas raised the rifle and slammed the stock against the cabin door hard enough that the echo rang out like thunder. It was not a greeting, not an agreement. It was a warning. Outside, laughter rose, harsh and grating. "So that's your answer then," the voice called. "Shame could have made this easy." The crunch of boots retreated briefly, then silence pressed close again. Thomas's chest tightened. Silence in the mountains was never empty. It was always waiting, watching. He turned from the door, moving to the window slit once more. His eyes scanned the tree line, the shed, the stretch of white that seemed endless. Nothing moved at first. Then he saw it, the faint shimmer of steel catching the morning light. A rifle barrel, barely visible, aimed toward the cabin. Thomas cursed inwardly, not with words but with the tightening of every muscle in his frame. They weren't just threatening. They were preparing. He pulled back quickly, ducking low as a shot cracked through the stillness. The bullet splintered the wood near the shutter, spraying sharp fragments across the floor. Clara wailed instantly, the sound raw and panicked. Miriam clutched her tighter, curling herself protectively around the child as if her body alone could shield her. Thomas crawled across the floor, moving with practiced instinct born of years of hunting and hiding. He reached Miriam's side, his hand brushing her shoulder. "Stay low," he murmured. "Whatever happens, don't move unless I tell you." Her eyes glistened with fear, but she nodded, clutching Clara so tightly her knuckles blanched. Another shot rang out, this one striking the logs of the cabin wall with a dull thud. The men outside weren't wasting bullets yet. They were testing, probing, waiting to see if he would break. Thomas steadied himself against the table, lifting the rifle in his hands. His breathing slowed, his pulse finding its rhythm. He had lived his life alone because he had chosen it. But now, with the weight of two souls inside his cabin, he understood solitude had been a mercy. Now responsibility burned in him like fire, and there was no walking away. A voice outside called again, sharper now, tinged with impatience. "Last chance, Mountain Man, she don't belong to you. That child don't belong to you. Hand him over and you get to keep your quiet life." Thomas lowered his head for a moment, eyes closing briefly. His quiet life had ended the moment Miriam's knock cracked against his door. When he opened them again, his gaze was hard, set with iron resolve. He leaned low to Miriam, his words sharp but steady. "I gave you my word, and I don't break my word." Her eyes filled with tears at that, and she whispered, barely audible, "God help us." Outside, the crunch of boots began again, closer, heavier. Thomas lifted his rifle, pressing his back against the wall by the door. His breath came slow and steady. If they wanted what was his to protect, they would have to pay for every step. The cabin, once a place of silence and solitude, now felt like the heart of a storm. And Thomas Hale, the man who had sworn to keep no company but the trees, found himself on the edge of a fight he had never asked for, yet one he could not turn away from. The next knock would not be with knuckles, it would be with fire and steel. The cabin walls trembled with each gust of wind, but it was not the storm outside that tightened Thomas Hale's grip on the rifle. It was the sound of boots crunching closer, deliberate and unhurried, circling like wolves testing the strength of their prey. He knelt low by the hearth, the flicker of firelight throwing sharp planes across his face, while Miriam clutched Clara against her chest in the shadows of the cot. Clara whimpered softly, her cry muffled against her mother's breast. Miriam rocked gently, her lips brushing against the crown of her daughter's head in whispers Thomas could not hear but could guess. Pleased to heaven, words a mother speaks when her body has nothing left but her faith. Her eyes found his across the gloom, wide, desperate, but also steady. She was trusting him, wholly and without question. That trust was heavier than the rifle in his hands. The men outside had gone quiet, but silence was never empty. Thomas crawled low toward the shutter again, the wood biting cold under his palm as he pressed his shoulder against the wall. He angled one eye against the crack and froze. There, just beyond the shed, a man leaned low, his breath fogging the air, his rifle braced steady against the snowbank. His coat was finer than anything made for the mountains, black wool pressed and cut neat, with buttons that gleamed faintly when the light struck them. His hat sat low, shadowing his eyes, but Thomas didn't need to see them to know the type. This was no drifter or desperate outlaw. This was someone used to giving orders and having them followed. He counted quickly. 2 more moved behind him, half hidden by the trees. 3 men, maybe more, circling. Too many. Alone, Thomas could slip into the pines and vanish, but not with Miriam fevered and Clara weak in her arms. Running wasn't an option, neither was surrender. The leader raised a gloved hand, motioning to the men behind him. Thomas saw the signal, the way soldiers and hunters use when they close in on prey. His stomach hardened. They were preparing to rush. The knock came again. Not with knuckles this time, but the butt of a rifle slamming into the door so hard the hinges groaned. Clara screamed, her thin cry rising sharp into the rafters. Miriam bent over her child, whispering frantically, shushing against tears she couldn't stop. Thomas's voice cut across the chaos, low and firm. Stay on the floor. Don't rise up no matter what you hear. He pressed his back against the wall beside the door, rifle steady in his hands. His breath slowed, each inhale deliberate, each exhale controlled. The world outside narrowed to this one moment, the space between the heartbeat and the breach. The door shuddered under another blow, splinters cracked, then silence again, long, dragging silence. And then a voice smooth as oil, the same voice as before. Thomas Hale, the man called, his words cutting clean through the cold. Thomas stiffened. His name. How did they know his name? You've lived alone out here near a decade. You've turned away company, turned away town, turned away the world. I respected that in my way. But now you've taken in something that doesn't belong to you, and I can't respect that. Thomas didn't answer. His jaw clenched. Whoever this man was, he knew far more than any stranger should. You've got a sick woman and her child, the voice continued, slow and certain. Hand them over and you'll live the rest of your days the way you always wanted. Quiet. Alone. This isn't your fight, mountain man. Never was. The words slid into the room like smoke, coiling into the corners, tempting with their poisoned reason. Miriam's eyes widened, her face pale. She clutched Clara tighter, shaking her head. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Thomas didn't need to hear it. He knew what she was saying. Don't. The leader's voice hardened. Or keep silent and we'll come in. Either way, she leaves with us. That child leaves with us. A pause, the faint scrape of boots against the snow as he stepped closer. Then, softly, almost like a final nail in the coffin, choose your silence wisely, Hale. Thomas drew in a breath, his teeth grinding as he exhaled slow. He shifted his rifle, pressing the butt firm against his shoulder. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried through the cracks in the wood like iron. "My choice was made last night." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond. The silence outside broke with a roar. Boots charged, pounding against the snow. The cabin door rattled under fists and rifle butts. Shouts rose, sharp and angry, overlapping in a chorus of threat. Thomas fired. The crack of his rifle thundered in the small space, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. The bullet tore through the shutter, splintering wood, and outside a man cursed loud in pain before dropping into the snow. The shouting grew louder, angrier. Shots answered, bullets slamming into the cabin walls, biting deep into timber, spraying splinters across the room. Miriam ducked lower over Clara, her thin frame a shield. The child wailed, her cries piercing, desperate, alive. Thomas moved quick, reloading, his hands steady despite the storm raging both outside and within. His body knew the motions. Years of hunting had trained him well, but this wasn't deer or elk. This was men who wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He fired again through the window crack. A cry rang out, cut short. Another body dropped into the snow. The return fire came fiercer, bullets slamming hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. The cabin groaned, each impact echoing like a warning that would not hold forever. Thomas ducked low, pulling another round into place. His breath ragged now, though his hands never faltered. He crawled across the floor, angling himself near the other shutter, eyes scanning for movement. And there he saw him, the leader, standing bold, not ducking, not hiding. His coat flared dark against the snow, his hat tilted low. His eyes, sharp and certain, met Thomas's through the crack for the briefest second. A smile curved his lips. It wasn't the smile of a man threatened. It was the smile of a man who already believed he had won. Thomas fired. The leader stepped aside just as the bullet tore past, snow spraying where it struck. He didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. He only raised his hand again, signaling his men forward. They weren't retreating, they were closing in. The cabin shook under the next assault, the door groaning, the shutters rattling. Thomas braced himself, rifle ready. His lungs burned with the weight of it, but his resolve burned hotter. He had made a vow, and he would not break it, no matter what storm of men or bullets came through that door. Miriam's voice rose behind him, trembling, desperate but strong with the force of her plea. "Please, Thomas, don't let them take her." He glanced back only once, just long enough to see her eyes, wet with tears, blazing with a mother's last strength. Clara whimpered in her arms, her tiny hand clinging to Miriam's sleeve. Thomas turned back toward the door, his voice low, steady, final. "They won't." The latch shuddered, the wood cracked, and as the door began to splinter, the mountain man squared his shoulders, ready to meet the storm. The door gave a tortured groan, wood splintering as iron boots struck it again and again. Thomas Hale braced his shoulder against the frame, rifle angled low, the barrel smoking from the last volley he had fired. The cabin, once the fortress of his solitude, felt smaller now, its every wall tested, every timber strained beneath the storm of men hammering at its threshold. Miriam pressed herself tighter into the cot, cradling Clara beneath her shawl. The baby whimpered, her tiny cries muffled against her mother's breast, as if even at that age she understood danger pressed close around them. Miriam's lips moved constantly, though no sound rose above the gunfire and boots outside. Prayer had become her last weapon, and she wielded it with the quiet ferocity of a soul unwilling to surrender. The leader's voice cut through the chaos, rising above the din with sharp clarity. "Hale, don't be a fool. You're one man, you can't hold against us. Give up the woman and child and you walk away." Thomas's jaw clenched. His silence had been his answer once, but not now. His voice, when it came, was like gravel grinding together, deep and unyielding. "Step through this door and you'll never leave it." The laughter that followed was cruel, echoing against the cabin walls. So be it. The next strike shattered the latch. The door flung inward, slamming against the wall as Snow and men surged into the room. Thomas fired the instant the first figure appeared, the shot booming like thunder. The man's body lurched backward, collapsing into the snowdrift outside, but another rushed in behind him. Thomas swung the rifle like a club, the butt cracking hard against the intruder's skull. The man staggered, blood spraying across the timber floor as he dropped, but not before his rifle discharged, the bullet whistling past Thomas's ear and splintering the mantel. Sparks rained from the fire as logs collapsed, smoke filling the room with a choking haze. The fight had breached his home. Thomas stepped back, reloading with swift, practiced hands. His heart pounded not from fear but from the hard rhythm of survival. He had hunted alone for years, survived storms that swallowed lesser men, yet never had he been cornered with the stakes so high. Clara's cry rang behind him, a reminder sharper than any blade. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. Two men burst through the doorway together, shoulders low, rifles leveled. Thomas dropped to one knee, firing quick. The first man fell instantly, the bullet striking his chest, but the second pressed forward, roaring, his weapon aimed straight at Thomas's heart. Thomas lunged sideways, the shot tearing through the sleeve of his coat instead of flesh. He rolled, came up low, and swung his hunting knife in a vicious arc. Steel met flesh, and the intruder collapsed with a guttural cry, clutching at his side. Blood spread quickly across the floorboards, seeping into the grain, the coppery tang mixing with the smoke in the air. The fire crackled violently, flames threatening to leap beyond the hearth as chaos consumed the cabin. Miriam's scream split the air, sharp and terrified. Thomas spun toward her in time to see a shadow looming near the cot. One of the intruders had slipped in amidst the chaos, his hand clawing for Clara. Miriam struck weakly, her frail body no match, her voice breaking as she cried, "No!" Thomas roared, a sound torn from the deepest part of him, and hurled his knife across the room. The blade struck true, burying deep into the man's shoulder. He stumbled back with a howl, crashing against the wall, the child slipping from his grasp before he could steal her. Thomas crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand gripping the man's collar, slamming him hard against the logs. "You think I'll hand them over?" His voice was a growl, low and edged with deadly calm. "Over my grave." He drove his fist into the man's jaw, the crack echoing above the roar of the fire. The body went limp, sliding to the floor. But no victory lasted long. Through the smoke and gunpowder haze, the leader himself stepped inside. His coat was untouched by snow, his boots polished even in the mire of blood and ash. His eyes, cold, calculating, swept the room with disdain. The corners of his lips curled into that same mocking smile Thomas had seen through the shutter. "Impressive," he said, voice smooth as glass. "But you're wasting your strength. I don't want you dead, Hale, not yet. I want the woman, the child. Hand them over and I'll leave you in peace." Thomas raised his rifle, the barrel steady, the fire's glow flickering against his hard features. His voice cracked through the smoke. "You'll leave, but you'll leave empty-handed." The leader's gaze sharpened, his hand twitching near the pistol at his hip. "You think you can stop me? I know you're kind, solitary, broken, a man clinging to nothing but silence. You can't build, you can't keep. You'll wither out here just the same. Why not give her to someone who knows what to do with her?" Miriam's voice rose from the cot, thin but fierce. "Over my dead body." The leader's smile widened, cruel. "That can be arranged." He drew. The flash of steel caught the firelight. Thomas fired at the same instant. The room exploded in sound, gunshots colliding, smoke filling every corner. The leader staggered, his coat torn by the bullet's path, but his own shot grazed Thomas's temple, blood streaking down into his beard. The mountain man barely faltered. He surged forward, tackling the intruder, both crashing hard onto the table. The wood splintered under their combined weight, mugs and dishes shattering as the two men grappled. The leader's strength was surprising, his fists striking with precision, each blow calculated. Thomas grunted, blocking, countering, his knuckles driving into the man's ribs. They rolled across the wreckage, the fire's glow spilling across their faces, both grim masks of determination. The leader gripped Thomas's throat, pressing down with iron force. Spots burst in Thomas's vision as his air dwindled, but his hand groped along the floor, finding the broken table leg. With the last of his strength, he swung it upward, cracking it against the man's skull. The grip loosened. Thomas shoved him aside, gasping, blood dripping from his brow. He staggered to his feet, rifle raised once more, but the leader was gone. He had slipped back into the smoke, vanishing through the shattered door into the storm outside. Silence returned, heavy and choking, broken only by Clara's cries and Miriam's sobs. Thomas lowered the rifle slowly, chest heaving. His cabin lay in ruins, blood and splinters scattered across the floor. Two bodies lay still. Another groaned faintly where Thomas's knife had struck. But the leader was alive, and he wasn't retreating. He was planning. Thomas wiped the blood from his temple, his eyes hardening as he looked to Miriam and the child. "This isn't over," he muttered. Miriam's gaze met his, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then we have to be ready for her." Thomas nodded once, slow and firm. He had chosen his silence long ago, but now words were no longer enough. He would fight. And the storm outside would have to reckon with a mountain man who no longer stood alone. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood. The fire hissed and spat where embers had fallen onto the floorboards, and the walls bore the scars of bullets, dark holes splintered into the pine like wounds that would never heal. Thomas Hale stood at the shattered door, rifle gripped tight, eyes narrowing into the snow-whipped dawn where the leader had vanished. The storm had eased to a whisper now, but that silence carried no comfort. It was the silence of men gathering themselves for another strike. Behind him, Miriam coughed weakly, clutching Clara to her chest. Her shawl was damp with sweat, and her face, though paler than before, was set with the stubborn will of a mother who refused to yield. Clara squirmed, fussing softly, her small cries muffled against the crook of Miriam's arm. Even in that frailty, Thomas felt a spark, the sound of life continuing, refusing to be snuffed out. He turned from the doorway, moving back into the cabin. His boots crunched over glass and splintered wood, his breath steaming in the air. He crouched by Miriam's cot, his voice low. "You hurt." She shook her head, though the motion was unsteady. "Not like them," she whispered, nodding toward the still forms of the fallen intruders. One groaned faintly, struggling against the knife wound in his shoulder. Thomas's jaw tightened as he crossed to the man, towering above him. The intruder's eyes flickered open, fear showing now where arrogance had once been. Thomas knelt, the rifle barrel pressing firm against the man's chest. "Who is he?" His voice was sharp, gravel dragged across stone. The man grimaced, sweat beading on his forehead. "You'll kill me either way." Thomas leaned closer, the steel unyielding. "Answer." The intruder coughed, spitting blood into the dust. "Crow, Matthew Crow, he don't stop. Not for you, not for nobody. That woman, she was his. That baby's his claim. He'll burn the mountains down before he lets Em go." The name struck Miriam like a blow. She stiffened, her arms tightening around Clara. "He's no father," she rasped, her voice shaking with fury. "He's a curse." The intruder gave a twisted smile despite his pain. "Call him what you will. He'll come back with more men, with fire." Thomas's eyes darkened. He pressed harder with the rifle until the man hissed in pain. "Not if you don't walk out of here." The intruder's breath came quick, his confidence cracked. "Please don't." But Thomas didn't finish him. He only pulled the rifle back, his voice low and cold. "Crawl. Tell Crow the mountain man says he'll find nothing but graves if he tries again." The man's eyes widened, terror replacing bravado. He staggered to his feet, clutching his wound, and stumbled through the broken doorway into the snow, leaving a dark trail behind him. His shadow disappeared quickly into the pines, swallowed by the white silence. Thomas turned back to Miriam. She was trembling, her breath ragged, but her eyes burned steady. "He won't stop," she said softly, her voice heavy with knowledge carved from fear and memory. "You don't know what he's capable of." Thomas sat heavily on the broken remains of the table, running a bloodied hand down his face. His body ached, his temple throbbed from the graze of Crow's bullet, but it was the weight of her words that pressed hardest. "Then we don't wait for him." Miriam frowned, exhausted but alert. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, elbows braced against his knees, eyes hard. "If Crow's coming back with more, we won't be here to meet him. There's a ridge north, thick timber, caves deep enough to hide. Harder country, but safe enough if you know where to step. We move before dusk." Her face tightened with doubt. "I can't walk far." Thomas's gaze shifted to Clara, then back to Miriam. "Then I'll carry you both if I have to, but we can't stay." Miriam looked down at her child, Clara's tiny fist clutching the edge of her shawl. Tears brimmed her eyes. "She won't last another run. She's hungry, weak. She needs more than just hiding." Thomas stood, moving to the shelf where he kept his scant supplies. He pulled down a pouch of dried meat, a jar of honey thickened with age, and what little flour remained. He set them on the table, the clatter loud in the stillness. "It's not much, but it's enough to get us through, enough to keep moving." Miriam's tears slipped free, streaking down her cheeks. "Why are you doing this? You could have turned us away last night, and none of this would be yours to carry." Thomas paused, his back to her, shoulders rigid. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, then finally answered, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I gave my word, and because I've been alone too long." The admission hung heavy, more fragile than the gunfire and blood had been. He turned, eyes locking with hers. "You and the child, you're mine to protect now, and I won't fail you." Miriam held his gaze, her lips trembling before lowering her cheek to Clara's hair. "Then may God give you strength," she whispered. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparation. Thomas patched what holes he could in the cabin walls, not to defend but to buy time. He bundled supplies into a pack, wrapped thick blankets tight, and cut lengths of rope for climbing the northern ridge. Every motion was efficient, born of years spent surviving the harshest winters. But this time his solitude had sharpened into something else. Each knot tied, each strap pulled tight was for Miriam, for Clara. By dusk, the sky burned a pale gray, the storm breaking into scattered clouds. Thomas led Miriam from the cabin, her body frail but upright, Clara swaddled tight against her chest. They moved into the timber, their tracks swallowed quickly by drifting snow. The mountain swallowed them, each step harder than the last. The ridge loomed dark against the fading light, a jagged wall of rock and pine. Thomas moved ahead, cutting a path, his body broad against the wind. Miriam followed, leaning heavily on his arm, her breath ragged but steady. Clara whimpered softly, her small voice barely rising above the crunch of boots on snow. They reached the base of the ridge as night settled, the trees casting long shadows. Thomas scanned the dark line of forest behind them, his eyes narrowing. Nothing moved. Yet he knew Crow was not far. He could feel it, like a storm building unseen beyond the horizon. He guided Miriam toward a narrow cleft in the rocks, half hidden by fallen timber. "Here," he murmured. "Rest, I'll watch." Miriam sank gratefully onto the cold stone, clutching Clara close. Thomas stood at the mouth of the cleft, rifle in hand, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered trail below. The night pressed heavy, filled with the kind of silence that carried threat. Far below, faint and distant, a light flickered, a torch swaying, then another, then more. Thomas's chest tightened. Crow was coming. And this time he wouldn't come with 3 men. He would come with many. The first torch bobbed like a lone star against the darkness, its glow muted by the thick snow falling slow and heavy from the ridge above. Thomas Hale narrowed his eyes, his body motionless at the mouth of the cleft, the rifle resting but ready across his arms. He watched as a second torch flared to life below. Then a third. Then half a dozen more. The pines seemed to cough them out one by one, until the white silence of the mountains was stained with firelight. The men moved in a column, their shadows bending long across the snow. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized the hard, unhurried stride of soldiers or hunters who had marched together before, and at their head walked Matthew Crow. His coat swung wide against the wind, his hand resting casual on the butt of his pistol. His voice carried faintly up the slope, commanding but calm, as if he had all the time in the world to take back what he believed was his. Behind Thomas, Miriam stirred. She had not slept, though he had urged her to. Fever still flushed her cheeks, but her eyes were sharp in the firelight that bled faint through the cleft. She clutched Clara close, rocking gently, the child nestled against her breast. The baby's small hand had curled around a fold of Miriam's shawl, refusing to let go even in slumber. "Thomas," Miriam's voice was barely more than a whisper, raw and tight. "He didn't turn. They've found us." Her arms tightened around Clara. "How many?" "Too many," he muttered. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crack of branches below as Crow's men pushed deeper into the slope. Then Miriam's voice rose again, trembling but clear. "You don't have to do this. Take Clara, take her, and go higher into the ridge. Leave me." Thomas finally turned, his eyes cutting through the dimness to her. Her face was pale, her body weak, but the fire in her words was fierce. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Not in this lifetime." Her lips parted, ready to protest again, but the finality in his voice stopped her. She bowed her head, pressing her cheek to Clara's crown. "Then may heaven guard you." Thomas moved back to the entrance, crouching low. The torches were closer now, weaving between the pines like a river of fire. He counted at least 10 men, maybe more. He traced their path, noted where the ridge narrowed, where the drifts hung heavy, where the boulders jutted from the snow. The mountain had been his only companion all these years. Tonight it would be his ally. He shifted, grabbing a loose stone the size of his palm, and hurled it down the slope. It struck the crust of ice, setting off a cascade of snow that tumbled into the darkness. Shouts rang out below, men scattering as the slope gave way, burying torches in white. One flame winked out entirely, the muffled cry of a man swallowed by snow echoing faint before silence claimed him. Thomas reloaded his rifle, the click echoing sharp in the cleft. He breathed slow, steadying himself, every sense sharpened to a hunter's edge. For years he had lived alone, choosing the quiet over the company of men. But now the silence had found its purpose. It was the silence before the strike. Crow's voice rose from below, strong and commanding. "Hold steady, he thinks the mountain will fight for him. It won't, we climb." Torches lifted again, men regrouping, pressing higher. The firelight crept closer, casting the ridge into stark relief. Thomas fired. The crack shattered the night, echoing down the slopes like a thunderclap. A torch fell, tumbling end over end into the snow, its bearer collapsing without a sound. Chaos rippled through the column, shouts rising as the men scrambled for cover. Thomas ducked back into the cleft, his hands already working to reload. His pulse thudded in his ears, but his movements were steady, sure. Behind him, Miriam whispered prayers into Clara's hair, each word trembling yet strong, a lifeline of faith cutting through the storm of violence. The first bullet struck the rocks around them, sharp sparks spraying into the dark. Thomas pressed his back against the stone, teeth clenched. They were firing blind, but it wouldn't take long before they closed enough to aim true. He scanned the ridge. Snow hung thick on the ledges above, waiting for a heavy step or the crack of a rifle to send it loose. He drew his knife, wedged it into a seam in the rock, and pried. The stone shifted. He shoved hard, sending a boulder rolling down into the trees. The crash thundered through the slope, followed by a second wave of snow and ice. Men shouted, torches scattering. Another flame snuffed out, swallowed by the avalanche. Crow's voice rose above the din, sharper now, edged with fury. "Hail, you think you can bury me in stone? You'll run out of mountain before I run out of men." Thomas pressed back into the cleft, his breath misting white in the cold air. His temples still throbbed from Crow's graze, the blood drying stiff against his brow. Yet his eyes burned with iron resolve. "Then come take her," he growled into the night. The torches regrouped, rising higher. A bullet struck the stone near Thomas's head, shards slicing his cheek. He ignored it, sighting down his rifle again. He picked his target, another torchbearer, and squeezed. The man dropped, his flame tumbling dark into the snow. But the column pressed on. Crow led them himself now, his pistol gleaming in the torchlight. He moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the ridge where Thomas stood. Miriam shifted behind him, her voice low, urgent. "Thomas, if he reaches us." "He won't." But even as he said it, Thomas knew the truth. The ridge would not hold forever. The mountain could claim some, but not all. Crow would climb, and when he did, Thomas would have to meet him face to face. The thought did not stir fear. It stirred something deeper, older, a fire that had lain dormant in him through years of silence. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was keeping his word. It was proving that even a man who had buried his heart in solitude could still stand when it mattered most. The mountain answered first. A low rumble shivered through the ridge, deep as the growl of an ancient beast. Snow cracked along the ledges above, breaking free in sheets. Thomas had been waiting for it, baiting it with stones and bullets, and now gravity itself joined his fight. White thunder poured down the slope, sweeping torches and men into its grasp. Shouts rose, panicked and broken, before being smothered in snow. Still, Crow pressed on. He leapt from one boulder to the next, his movements fluid, his eyes locked on the cleft. The avalanche swallowed his men, but not him. He moved like a man born for storms, refusing to bend, refusing to break. Thomas fired, the rifle's crack splitting the night. The bullet tore through the air, striking Crow's shoulder. The leader staggered but did not fall. He pressed a hand to the wound, blood blooming dark against the white, and laughed, a sound that chilled even the mountain air. "You think you've stopped me?" Crow roared, climbing higher, closer. "I'll take her, Hale, I'll take the child, and you'll watch me do it." Thomas dropped the empty rifle, the steel clattering against stone. He reached instead for the hunting axe strapped to his belt, its blade honed sharp from years of splitting wood and bone. His breath came steady, his chest heaving with the weight of choice. He had lived his life alone, but he would not die that way. Not tonight. Miriam's voice rose behind him, breaking against the wind. "Thomas, please." He turned his head just enough to see her, pale and fevered, her eyes wide with fear and faith intermingled. Clara stirred in her arms, her small cry piercing the storm. That sound anchored him deeper than any root could. He faced forward again, his grip tight on the axe. Crow reached the ledge, hauling himself up with raw strength. He stood there, pistol in one hand, blood seeping from his wound, his breath fogging the air. His smile returned, cruel and triumphant. "This ends now." Thomas stepped forward, his silhouette filling the cleft. His voice was low, steady, final. "You're right, it does." Crow fired. The shot cracked past Thomas's ear, close enough to sear skin. Thomas lunged, the axe arcing in a broad, vicious swing. Steel met pistol, the blade biting deep into the barrel, snapping it in two. Crow staggered, eyes wide in disbelief, before Thomas drove his shoulder into him. They crashed against the rock, grappling in the snow, fists and fury colliding. Crow struck hard, his knuckles splitting Thomas's lip, but Thomas answered with a blow to the ribs, then another to the jaw. The two men rolled dangerously close to the ledge, their bodies half in shadow, half in firelight. Crow clawed for Thomas's throat, pressing down, his weight crushing. "She's mine," he spat, blood flecking his teeth. Thomas's vision swam, his air thinning, but his hand found the haft of the axe again. With a guttural roar, he swung upward, burying the blade into the rock beside Crow's head. The shock jarred the leader's grip loose, and Thomas twisted, pinning him down. His fist drove into Crow's face once, twice, until the man's body slackened. Thomas rose, chest heaving, his breath ragged in the thin mountain air. Crow lay still at his feet, his blood seeping into the snow, his torch sputtering out in the drift. The slope below was littered with silence, his men either buried by the avalanche or scattered into the dark. For the first time in what felt like years, the mountain was quiet again. Thomas turned back into the cleft. Miriam sat huddled against the stone, Clara pressed tight against her heart. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, though whether from fear, relief, or both, Thomas could not tell. When he stepped inside, she looked up at him with eyes that saw not just the man who had fought, but the man who had chosen them. "Is it over?" she whispered. Thomas wiped blood from his brow, his voice gravel but certain. "It's over." He sank beside her, his body aching, his hands still trembling from the fight. Clara whimpered, her small cry soft and thin, and Thomas reached out. Miriam hesitated only a moment before placing the child in his arms. Clara nestled against his chest, her warmth soaking through the blood and sweat. Thomas looked down at her tiny face, her eyelids fluttering as sleep pulled her back into peace. His throat tightened, his eyes stinging with a heat he hadn't felt in years. He pressed his cheek against her soft crown, whispering words meant only for her. "You're safe. You'll always be safe." Miriam leaned against the stone, her strength nearly gone, but her lips curved in a faint, weary smile. "You kept your word." Thomas met her gaze, "And I always will." The night stretched long, the wind curling low through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of violence. Dawn crept slowly, pale light spilling across the ridge, painting the snow gold. The storm had passed. By morning, the three of them descended into the timber, leaving the battlefield behind. Crow's shadow would never fall over them again, and though the road ahead was uncertain, hard country, harder days, Thomas Hale no longer walked it alone. He walked it as something more. Not just a mountain man, not just a protector. A father. The valley lay hushed beneath the weight of new snow, the mountains towering silent as sentinels. Smoke curled from the chimney of a cabin that had seen fire and blood and nearly fallen beneath both. Yet now it stood repaired, patched with fresh-hewn timber, its walls stronger for the breaks it had endured. Within, the warmth of a steady hearth spread across the room, not just heat but something deeper, life. Miriam sat by the fire, her body wrapped in quilts, her fever long broken. Her cheeks held color now, faint but steady, her eyes brighter than when she had first collapsed against Thomas Hale's door. She rocked gently, cradling Clara, whose tiny breaths came even and sure. The baby's hands no longer trembled from hunger, her face flushed with the peace of full sleep. Miriam hummed, soft and low, her voice blending with the crackle of the logs. Thomas stood near the window, sharpening the edge of his axe with deliberate strokes. His hands were steady, his movements patient, but his eyes lingered not on the blade but on the scene behind him. Each glance toward the hearth softened the lines of his face, chiseling away the loneliness that had been carved there over years of silence. The mountain had changed him, or perhaps it had only revealed what he had buried beneath solitude. He had chosen silence once, now he chose something else. Miriam looked up, catching his gaze. "You've done more than you promised," she said quietly, her voice steady though tired. "You didn't just keep her safe, you saved me too." Thomas's hand stilled on the axe. He set it aside, crossing the floor in slow, heavy steps. He lowered himself onto the stool beside her, his eyes fixed on the small face pressed against her breast. "I only did what had to be done." Her lips curved faintly. "No, Thomas, you did more, you gave us a home." The words settled heavy in the quiet, not as a burden but as a truth. He had thought himself a man bound to the mountain, chained to solitude. But now the walls of the cabin held not just his breath, but the breaths of three. And that made all the difference. Clara stirred then, her tiny hand reaching outward. Thomas hesitated before offering his finger. She gripped it tight with surprising strength, her eyelids fluttering as though she already knew him. His throat tightened, his voice low and raw. "She's stronger than I thought." Miriam's eyes shone with quiet pride. "She gets it from you." For a long moment the three sat in silence, the fire burning steady, the storm outside no longer a threat but a memory. The danger had passed, yet Thomas knew the world beyond the ridge would not stay quiet forever. There would be more trials, more storms, more men like Crow. But for the first time in years he did not dread them, because he would not face them alone. He rose, taking his coat from the peg and shrugging it over his shoulders. At the door he paused, glancing back at Miriam and Clara. "I'll fetch water before night, then I'll bring more wood in." Miriam nodded, her smile faint but full of trust. "We'll be here." Thomas stepped outside into the crisp air, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The ridge stretched high above, its scars still visible where stone and snow had fallen. But the cabin stood steady against it, smoke curling into the sky like a banner of survival. He filled the bucket at the creek, his reflection staring back at him in the icy water. For years he had seen nothing but a solitary man marked by silence. Now he saw something else, a protector, a provider, a father. The weight of that word settled deep in his chest, not as a burden but as a vow renewed. When he returned, Miriam looked up from the hearth, her voice soft but certain. "Thomas." He paused in the doorway, snow clinging to his shoulders. "You're not alone anymore." The words filled the cabin like light. He stepped inside, closing the door against the cold, the fire's warmth wrapping around him once more. For the first time in years, Thomas Hale smiled. Not the fleeting twitch of lips, not the guarded mask of a man fending off the world, but a true, quiet smile born of something lasting. The mountains would still rage, storms would still come, but within these walls something stronger had taken root. A family,